The world is quickly changing, and the Trump administration is taking actions now that will impact lumber prices, lumber availability, and our forest for generations. In this video, we're going to talk about what's happening and what it all means, so stick around. The first few weeks of the second Trump administration have seen a flurry of activity and executive orders, and things are changing. The question is whether these changes will have a net benefit or whether they will cause some kind of terrible damage. Whether your opinion falls on one side or the other probably has to do with your political persuasion, but I'm going to do my best, as always, to present just the facts. But I also want to provide my thoughts on what I think this all means, so be sure to stick around to the end, where I break it all down and talk about what kind of impact this is going to have on lumber prices in the future. First, let's talk about all the things that are taking place that are having an impact on our forests and on lumber markets. The first major development to talk about is the reduction in force of federal employees that is impacting many government agencies. This is being spearheaded by Elon Musk's Doge team, and they've terminated an estimated 5,700 employees from the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of the Interior, which includes the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These firings have been indiscriminate, targeting mostly probationary employees. Probationary employees at the federal government are those who were generally hired within the past 2 years or who have recently moved into a new role within the past couple of years. This system has been around for about 20 years and was put in place in what was called a critical assessment opportunity, or essentially a way to evaluate a new hire or a new federal employee and get rid of them if they're not meeting expectations before some of the normal employment protections kick in, after which time it becomes much more difficult to fire them. Another recent development is the resignation of the 20th Forest Service Chief, Randy Moore. Randy Moore began serving as the Forest Service Chief in July of 2021 and has been with the Forest Service since 1981, serving in various capacities, including as the Pacific Southwest Regional Forester for nearly 15 years. The Trump administration has appointed a man named Tom Schultz to succeed him. Tom Schultz is a former Air Force officer and has managed trust lands and water resources for the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, and has served as the Idaho Department of Lands Director. Most recently, he was the Vice President of Resources and Government Affairs for the Idaho Forest Group, which is one of the largest U.S. lumber producers. The next recent development is a new executive order from Donald Trump around lumber production and use of lumber on federal lands. I'll leave a link to it down below if you want to check it out. It's titled Addressing the Threat to National Security from Imports of Timber Lumber. Basically, it says that the wood products industry is essential to the national security, economic strength, and industrial resilience of the United States. This industry plays a vital role in key downstream civilian industries, including construction. It goes on to state that it is the policy of the United States to ensure reliable, secure, and resilient domestic supply chains of timber, lumber, and their derivative products. And it goes on to say that they're going to be initiating an investigation into the current and projected demand for timber and lumber, the extent to which domestic production of timber and lumber can meet domestic demand, the role of foreign supply chains, and the feasibility of domestic capacity, among other things. Honestly, the executive order reads as pretty mundane, but it will have some significant impacts to lumber policy, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The last major change is tariffs. Now, I've already talked a lot about tariffs on this channel before, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but I will link to some of my other videos, so if you want to check those out and understand a little bit more, you certainly can. But what's important to understand right now is that we already have tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber of around 14%. That was raised by the Biden administration to that 14% a few months back from around 8%. Now, since taking office, Trump has not spoken specifically about Canadian lumber tariffs, but just this week he's talked about putting into place 25% tariffs on all goods coming in from Canada and Mexico, and presumably Canadian lumber would be part of that. Okay, so that was a lot, but what does all of this mean? Are these good things for the economy and for lumber prices and for forests, or will all of these things have a negative impact? Well, before we get into the details on that, I want to talk about this video's sponsor, Incogni. Now, you probably already know this, but your personal data is floating out there all over the internet. And there are data brokers who are collecting and selling your data. And that can be dangerous as it puts you at risk for things like scams, identity theft, or online harassment. Well, Incogni is a service that helps you get your data removed from sites like that. Incogni proactively reaches out to data brokers on your behalf and makes requests for your personal data to be removed from those sites. And the best part about it is that the whole process is automated. Since using Incogni myself, I've seen a noticeable difference in the amount of both spam calls and spam emails that I'm getting. And so I know that it's working. So take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code DIY with Dave at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. That's code DIY with Dave at the link below. Now back to the video. So as I mentioned, there are 4 major shifts happening right now. The first is the reduction in federal workers at the Forest Service and other government agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Then there is the resignation of the current Forest Service's chief, the recent executive orders, and the tariff on Canadian goods. All of these things have the potential to impact our forests, lumber availability, and lumber prices going forward. So let's talk about each of them and what it all means. First, let's talk about the firings in federal agencies. These firings have, for the most part, been indiscriminate, and there does not really appear to be any kind of evaluation of what these employees did or whether they serve some kind of critical function. They're just kind of firing a percentage or whatever employees that they can. In the Forest Service itself, they fired around 1,000 employees, which includes foresters and biologists, EMTs at the parks, locksmiths, custodial staff, and others. And since those original firings, they've actually had to rehire about 50 employees to make sure that national park facilities in certain areas can actually be cleaned and maintained and open. They're now also allowing for the hiring of some seasonal employees because we've got the summer starting here fairly soon, and so they need those seasonal employees to man the parks for the summer rush. But the fact is that all of these firings are short-sighted. The Forest Service doesn't pay a lot, and it's been chronically short-staffed for ages. Cutting these jobs is not going to make a meaningful impact to the deficit, and it will likely cost more in the future due to deferred maintenance and other issues, as well as the fact that our national park facilities will suffer, and we'll likely see a lot of those impacts starting this summer. In fact, one of those fired Forest Services employees, who only makes $40,000 a year, by the way, was interviewed, and here's a clip of what he said.
We are standing in Yosemite National Park. For the past 10 months, I was a custodial worker here. I picked diapers off the side of the road, toilet paper, beer bottles, cigarette butts, you name it, so you didn't have to see it.
Now his work, although small, is important, and now it's not going to be done. That's going to have a negative impact on the environment and the quality of a person's experience at Yosemite. And it isn't just custodial staff though. There's also been tasked with prevention of forest fires or staff who are ensuring water quality or maintaining trails. Those people are not there anymore, and that's going to cause some problems. And ultimately, I'm afraid that it's going to be counterproductive and actually cause more damage in the long run than the amount of money saved in the short run. Now let's talk about President Trump's executive order. As I mentioned before, the actual words of the order are pretty mundane, but what it signals is a shift in forest policy. Now, let me show you what that means with a few graphs to illustrate the point. First of all, here is a graph of the amount of timber that's been harvested on federal lands from 1940 to 2022. What you can see here is that timber harvesting from public lands peaked in the 1980s and has been down ever since. This aligns with environmental actions that were taken in the 90s, but also aligns with a decline in foreign demand that took place around the same time and really decimated the industry. Now let's take a look at this pair of graphs showing the number of wildfires and the acres burned for a period of about 35 years starting in 1987. You can see that even though the number of fires has gone down, the amount of acres burned has actually doubled. In fact, over the past 10 years or so, about 25% of our national forests have burned down. That is a huge problem, and that's the backdrop for this executive order. The idea of the Trump administration is that the forests have been mismanaged for too long and we've lost too much to fire, and so we need to better manage our forests, and that should include increased logging activity. And that's really part of the shift in the policy. They're going to stop with a lot of the environmental regulations and focus more on logging. The shift in forest policy is also evidenced by who they ended up appointing as the chief of the Forest Service. On paper, Tom Schultz is definitely qualified, but he differs from the last chief as he comes from industry. Most recently, he worked for a logging company, one of the largest logging companies in the country. And so his focus is going to be on the lumber industry, on the logging industry. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's a terrible thing in theory. Our forests have been mismanaged, and even the Biden administration recognized that. And they were in the process of developing a new forest plan, which included expanded logging activity, even in some formerly protected areas, as a means to better manage the forests and potentially prevent losses from forest fires. The Trump administration, however, seems to be much more focused on generating revenue from the forests, and they are actively looking at ways to suspend certain environmental laws in order to speed up the logging process.
I'll be signing an executive order freeing up our forests so that we're allowed to take down trees and make a lot of money and then reharvest trees. Also, we're cutting fire divides, and those trees can be sold and made a lot of money with.
So they plan to auction off more timber from federal lands and to expand logging activity, but there's really two problems with that plan. The first is something we've already touched on a little bit, and that is that they don't appear to be giving any thought to environmental protections. In fact, they've fired many of the people from the BLM and the Fish and Wildlife Service who focus on environmental regulations. So there's not as many people to look out for those things. And there's a saying out there that when the cat's away, the mice all play. And if no one is enforcing environmental law, then those laws are going to be broken. Now, people may complain and say that the laws don't make sense, and that may be true in some cases, but if that is true, then let's get Congress to change the law. Republicans have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and so it shouldn't be that difficult to change something that needs to be changed, you would think anyway. The other problem is that demand for lumber is low right now. Interest rates have been pretty high for a long time, and home prices have also been high for a long time. And because of that, there's not a lot of building going on. To illustrate that, I've got a graph here of new housing starts in the US since the year 2000. You can see that it's pretty low considering the history. We have a housing shortage right now in this country, but new homes are not being built because people can't afford them. Added to that, many lumber mills have actually shut down operations entirely and closed down some mills. And that's due to the decline in demand and the relatively low prices for lumber at the moment. They're not going to be able to come back online right away. And in fact, they won't come back online even if there's a ready supply of timber to process if they can't sell the lumber. If they can't sell it, they can't afford to be in business. So you can auction off as many timber leases as you want, but if the demand isn't there, and if there aren't enough mills to process it, then it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter how much you open up the land to logging because there won't be a need for it. As a side note, there's another issue as well, and that is that it takes work from the Forest Service and other groups to prepare the timber auctions. And with reduced staff, that's going to be a challenge, and that could delay some of those timber sales. The other thing, and this one to me is maybe one of the most concerning things, is that the Trump administration has spoken of their desire to create a U.S. sovereign wealth fund. Many countries like Norway, for example, who have a lot of excess revenues from things like oil, create sovereign wealth funds to invest their surplus and earn some return from that. It appears that the Trump administration is planning on selling off public lands in order to fund the U.S. sovereign fund. Now, if our goal is to pay off the national debt, it really doesn't make much sense for us to create a national wealth fund. Something like that could definitely be created once the debt is paid or close to paid, but the bigger concern to me is that this land will likely be sold off to wealthy people and probably even foreign entities. And the idea of selling our public lands in that way really doesn't sit well with me, and I think it could have long-term negative impacts. The last thing, of course, is tariffs. Now, the Trump administration is talking about implementing a 25% tariff on everything coming from Canada, but the specifics on exactly what may receive tariffs and at what rate still remains to be seen. But as of right now, it appears that the tariff on softwood lumber coming in from Canada will likely be around 20%, which is an increase from the current 14%. The idea behind all this is that it will make lumber coming in from Canada more expensive and therefore make U.S. lumber more attractive to domestic buyers, thereby spurring the U.S. domestic lumber industry. Canada is not the only place, though, where we get our lumber. Around 68% or so of our lumber is produced domestically, and about 15% comes from Canada. The other 15% or so comes from a variety of different places, including China, Vietnam, Sweden, Germany, and Brazil, among other places. So if Canadian lumber is more expensive, we're likely to just buy our lumber from the next cheapest country on the list, unless domestic prices are competitive, which they may be, or they may not be. We'll have to see. The ultimate goal, though, of the tariffs is that domestic lumber production will increase. And so we're likely to see tariffs placed on those other countries as well in order to help the domestic supply increase. Whether this will actually work really remains to be seen. But it is going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight. And in the meantime, lumber prices will definitely go up. Additionally, while we import around $20 billion in lumber each year, we also export around $10 billion in lumber each year. Those exports will likely drop because there will be reciprocal tariffs. And also Canadian lumber may be more attractive to the countries that we're selling to right now. And Canada would be then more likely to sell to them to make up for the difference in what they're not selling in the US. This actually happened the last time Trump was in office. Trump, as you recall, started a trade war with China with tariffs in the mix, and imports of US lumber to China dropped, and as a result, China began importing far more lumber from Canada to make up the difference. All right, so I've been talking for a long time here, but let's get down to brass tacks and talk about the best case scenario and then the worst case scenario for lumber prices and for our forests. So the best case scenario is this. We succeed in expanding domestic logging, which not only reduces forest fires, but also leads to more supply, which reduces prices for lumber and spurs demand domestically. Lumber tariffs, maybe they also work and do their part to encourage domestic lumber harvesting and manufacturing. Perhaps even the housing market is revitalized because of the lower cost of building materials. Maybe rural communities are revitalized and jobs in the lumber industry are expanded and it becomes healthy again. Now on the flip side, here is the worst case scenario. We log our forests without regard to the environment, which leads to the loss of forest resources and natural landscapes that won't be replaced in our lifetimes. The logging also maybe doesn't have a meaningful impact to wildfires because it doesn't take into account other root causes such as climate change or forest encroachment. Not to mention the people who worked in fire prevention who lost their jobs, who are now not working in fire prevention. Maybe prices for lumber go up and domestic demand for lumber doesn't pick up, which means that the lumber mills don't reopen and the domestic supply doesn't grow, while simultaneously the demand for lumber exports also declines because of tariffs, further damaging the industry. Forest land is sold to the highest bidder and we lose access to our public lands. Now those two scenarios are very different. And I want to know what you think. Which scenario do you think is more likely, from your perspective? Or maybe there are some parts of one that you think are more likely to happen and maybe some parts of another. Leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. I want to hear what you guys think about what is going to happen with all of these crazy changes that are going on right now. Like most things though, I think that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There is a lot of change going on right now, and we actually really do have a real chance for something good to come out of all this. But we have to be careful and we have to be thoughtful. The fact is that our forests right now are sick and they need to be better managed. In a recent statement, the new Forest Service chief said this: "I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be the next chief of the Forest Service. I will work tirelessly to further support and protect our rural communities. Working with our partners, we will actively manage national forests and grasslands, increase opportunities for outdoor recreation, and suppress wildfires with all available resources, emphasizing safety and the importance of protecting resource values." Now that all sounds good to me and I wish him luck. I hope that we can both protect our forests and properly utilize them and balance the need for recreation and resource management and environmental protection. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to like it and share it with someone else who may also find it interesting. Please also be sure to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.